I was in New Zealand in May of 2019, and then I was also there again in April of 2018. I had to go
Okay.
2 years in a row, and I actually went for a client, and I flew into Auckland. It was a 2-week engagement, and I decided to take the weekend to enjoy myself. The first time in 2018, I went on a hunt, for a red stag over there, which is like a big thing in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And then the second year, I decided to take a week off and went to the South Island. Hung out
Wow.
in like Queenstown, went hiking everywhere. I did the whole like tour up to Christchurch and then flew out. So it was a really
That's
cool
awesome.
experience.
Last time I was in New Zealand, I was actually in Bogota, Colombia. And I get a call that said, "Hey, can you be in New Zealand in a few days?" Which, if you ever guess, there is no direct flight. So I'm like, all right. So I flew into Auckland after a couple connections. But what I really thought was cool was the whole Middle Earth thing, right? Of course, because they filmed Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So when you fly in, it says "Welcome to Middle Earth." And
Yeah.
go in, they had these massive displays, as I'm sure you saw. But the thing that really stuck with me is when it rains in Wellington. When I got down to walk around downtown Wellington, they call it Windy Wellington because the rain comes in sideways.
Oh, yeah.
It makes no sense to have an umbrella because it's not coming in from the top.
Yeah. You're going to have to like have side umbrellas to keep you.
So, any travel coming up?
I have to go to Miami next week. And then from Miami, I'm going to Minneapolis for 1 day meeting. And then from Minneapolis, I'm going to Mexico. And then from Mexico, I'm going to DC. And then after DC, I'm coming home.
So, no travel at all, really.
Yeah, it's about I had a good break up until next week. So like from the new year, I took a vacation in Puerto Vallarta, which
Oh,
was really
nice.
awesome.
Yeah.
And then I came back and I've been home for like a couple of weeks now, and that's been very relaxing. And then back on the road.
Well, cool. Well, your background's kind of interesting. You've been doing offensive work, red teaming, pen testing, however you want to categorize it, for a while, uh, but both on the public and the private sector. Did you start on the public sector side, or how did all that kind of evolve?
I actually started in the government, and I used to be like a hacker for the DoD
Okay.
in Quantico, Virginia, on the Marine Corps base there. And I did that right out of college, and I learned and trained with them for a while, and then from there, the master sergeant retired and decided to go to Mandiant after our whole stint in Quantico, and he brought me kind of on board with him. He was like, "Hey, you should come with me. It's in Northern Virginia, which is way more exciting than Quantico for a
Yeah.
young guy. Like closer to DC and Alexandria, there's a lot more happening. Quantico, it's like families and Marine people all over."
Sure.
So I said, sure, I'll go with you. And this was like 8 years ago. So that was back when we were private. And then we did a lot of commercial, clients, major companies, publicly traded companies, a lot of your Fortune 500. And I was more used to the government sector, which was a completely different sort of environment.
Yeah.
So I got a lot of exposure to a little bit of both, but I've been doing mostly, public sector for a while, a lot of public traded companies and Fortune 500. We do
Yeah.
government every once in a while, like but we have a whole government like division that does more of that kind of work that's separate from us, which we're on the professional services side, on the more of the commercial side.
Yeah. Yeah. So, any big differences between government work and doing it for a Fortune 500? Did it
To be
any
candid,
crush?
a lot of bureaucracy. So
Yeah.
like in
What? You're
in
kidding?
gov- yeah, in government, it's like, oh, I want to spin up a VM. You got to sign all these paperworks. It's got to go through this GS, 15, and then he's got to approve it. Then it's got to go to this
Sure.
lieutenant over here, and he's got to approve it. And between both of them, that could take who knows how long. So to spin up, like to say, for example, a VM, it could take you like, a couple of months. No kidding. Whereas
Yeah.
in the commercial side, you get a super efficient IT division, not on every company, but on a lot of them. I see a lot more efficiencies where they can do it within a couple of days, if not a couple of hours, if not a couple of minutes. I've
Oh, wow.
seen all of it. So yeah, that's one of the biggest differences is efficiencies, because these guys are making money. The government's more securing their infrastructure and whatnot, but it's a lot more policy driven, a lot more red tape and stuff like that.
Sure. Well, when we were talking the other day, you mentioned a few different use cases of red teaming when it goes right, and sometimes when it goes wrong. Um, Maybe you can share a couple of those stories.
Yeah, yeah, I will. I'll say one. I mean, just off the top of my head, one of the coolest ones that we've done is like a bank heist. Every time I say like, "Oh, we did a bank heist," and that's everyone's like, "Really? How does that work?" I mean, we're like, Ocean's 11, but
Yeah, the
on
Italian
more of a
job, Ocean's 11.
yeah, yeah, but on the digital side, it was
Yeah.
just super cool. So what we did was they provisioned us a bank account with like $1 in it and another bank account with nothing in it.
Hmm.
And the goal was to transfer the $1 to the other bank account undetected. So with nothing. We just had a company name, like a bank name, and we had to, get our way in through the internet, so generally through phishing, and then from there escalate privileges, move laterally, and then try to gain access to their Swift systems that do the bank transfers and do that again undetected. And the cool thing about this one was if we had
Yeah.
just accessed the systems and then sent that $1 to the other account, there would have been an alert because there has to be a checks and balances like a ledger like with it that to account for the transfer.
Yeah.
So we actually analyzed the accountants and how they do the whole process before we even did it. So think of us as just monitoring, these guys that do transfers, the systems that do transfers, the accountants to see what the full process is so we can replicate the same thing. And so that was really, really cool because at the end of the day, we had an outbrief with the CISO, and the CISO had the impression that we didn't do anything because there was no alerts and there was no detection. And they were like, so I guess y'all couldn't accomplish your objective, huh? And we were like, actually, we did, and we just didn't get detected. So we went through a bunch of recommendations around how they can better detect us, how they
Yeah.
can secure their infrastructure to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. And that was a really cool use case. And we can say we did a bank heist. So we've
And to
done quite a
really
few
prove that
since then.
use case out, did you transfer like another couple million out to the Caymans or anything, or was it just that dollar?
It was tempting. It was
It's
tempting.
tempting. So that's a great example of things going well. It's interesting that the CISO said, "Hey, I guess you didn't accomplish it," and you're like, "Hey, we did, and here's the details."
Yep.
Just he based that predicated on just not getting an alert, and we know that even in the best organizations, alerting maybe 50% of the time if you're really on the game, right? Um, so give me some examples of maybe it's gone bad, right? Either the process went bad or just something broke and had to be restarted in terms of
Yeah.
process or something.
Yeah, I mean, so generally, I mean, I've had a few examples of how things go wrong. I'll give you one that just comes to mind. So a lot of times, we like to not do any work on production systems. Like, hey, if we're doing a specific assessment of one like application or one thing, we generally require it on a non-production system.
Yep.
Well, in one case, this is going to sound super silly. In one case, they wanted us to do an application assessment on this specific application that was in production. And we're like, well, there's risks associated with that. Obviously, if something goes wrong, we could potentially, bring down the system or whatever.
Yeah.
And this one wasn't as huge of an impact, but nonetheless, we had provisioned accounts. Like think of like six provisioned accounts to access the application at various different levels, like the very different roles of the application itself. And so one of the things that we try to escalate privileges within the application itself. And whenever we were doing that, we couldn't quite get to where we wanted. So we were like, how is this like, how are they blocking down these permissions? So we found that we had a user that did have access to the areas that we wanted, and we had admin access eventually to the application itself, but admin didn't have access to this specific area, and neither did the accounts we have, just these two accounts did.
Yeah.
So we thought if we replicate the user groups to our accounts, then we can probably access the areas that we want to. And they were like literally probably 100 different user groups associated with this application. And we didn't know which ones were which. It was a lot
Yeah.
of like going through and whatever. So we tried a few of them that sounded like they made sense, and they didn't work entirely. So there was we wrote a small piece of code that would replicate the amount of groups or the exact groups from their account to our account. So
Mm.
then we can, make it complete, right? Well, one of the users that was doing this, one of like our operators, accidentally, like the users was like, think of like a letter and then like 6 digits afterwards, and that's a user account. He missed one of the digits at the end and put a different one, and ended up putting all the groups to some random other account that wasn't ours. And
Oh,
so that was like a thing gone bad, right? Like this could
yeah,
be a
yeah,
major impact that we just gave some random user account a crap ton of permissions,
yeah,
and on a production system that has production data.
yeah,
So this could be something that could be a huge impact, because this specific application hosted a lot of sensitive information of like customers.
yeah,
So what do we have to do? Obviously, we alerted the clients. And then the good news is we were able to revert back to a snapshot of the database that replicated the exact permissions before, and they had a super fast process to do it. But if they hadn't had that process, it could have been a crap show. We probably would have had to delete the account, create a new one, had to gone through the IT process and all that. So in this case, it was resolved within an hour,
yeah,
but it could have been a big deal.
yeah,
So we're
yeah.
super diligent, and we try to be about our processes now, because we don't want operators fat fingering one digit, for example, that could be a big impact. So that's something that went wrong on one of our engagements.
Yeah.
There's like a
It,
few, but like that one's one that gone wrong from like a process perspective, and just he was under a lot of pressure, and his
yeah.
finger just didn't hit the
Anybody
right
can
key.
type in the wrong. I mean, how many times have people typed in the wrong IP address, right? I
Hmm.
mean, that stuff happens. Um,
Exactly.
I what I think is interesting about that story though is it's the maturity of the team that can say, okay, a mistake was made. What do we need to do to fix this then? Juxtaposed to somebody that just goes out there and runs a bunch of scans and port mapping and automated tools, and all they know how to do is click go and print out the report. And we were chatting earlier about I guess it still happens sometimes today. I hope it doesn't happen that often, but in the early days of pen testing, a lot of it was just scanning and here's a report. And you print out this, 100, 200, 500 page report with all these things. And some of them were perhaps critical. Some weren't. Some were like, your SSL certificate is too old, or I can trace route from this network to this network. And, there's some ICMP echo requests going between these areas. And yeah, it wasn't always the most grievous stuff. But you kick it over to the blue team and you go, okay, here's our report. Go ahead and fix this. Then you come back in a quarter or 6 months or a year later, and you do the same scans, and all the same issues are there because the blue team, the SOC operation team, whatever, IT ops, never had time to get to those issues. Or they said, yeah, we know about these problems, but they never correct them. So you kind of had this weird sort of half-ass attempt to validate in review security, and then even worse attempt to go ahead and make use of that information, but then you keep on paying for it on a quarterly, biannual, annual basis, and it didn't really derive any value. Um, and we had chatted about there's really been a maturation, I think, in terms of how red teams operate. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that from both a technical perspective and sort of what's being done as opposed to just a bunch of scans, and then how that's then delivered to the customer as opposed to just a big old report.
Yeah, so that's actually a good topic, because it's one of the things I talk a lot with our clients about. Because sometimes we'll get clients that will call us and be like, hey, we want a vulnerability assessment. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, you just want us to scan, like you said, and generate a report and give it to you? Like, pretty much. And the reason for that, and I think the biggest driver for a lot of that in the industry is going to be compliance,
Mm.
because there's a lot of compliance policies and standards that require just a vulnerability scan on specific networks. Let's just say, for example, like PCI networks, which is payment card industry. That's going to be something where retailers have to, scan their PCI networks on a regular basis to ensure that they're, not vulnerable to certain things and whatnot. And that's good, I think, from a vulnerability management perspective. And personally, I think that people should do that in house versus hiring like really elite consultant agencies to do that for them.
Sure.
But nonetheless, we get a lot of requests to do that. So at this point, we actually kind of turn those down. Unless they're coupled with something larger, like let's just say, for example, like a real internal pen test where we go in and assess the entire infrastructure in addition to just running a vulnerability scan on the side, then that's something we're able to accommodate. But just scanning and giving a report is not cool. It's not sexy. It's not something that we want to do. Like our red team is a group of really, really solid, very technical people that love very technical challenges and complex puzzles.
Yeah.
So we would probably not be as excited doing work like that. We're scanning and reporting. So we honestly we don't do that at all,
Yeah.
unless it's again coupled with something a lot more larger or sexier.
And you even mentioned to the point of you've even turned down opportunities because you're like, look, you don't need us for this kind of work, right? This is
Exactly.
too simple. Yeah.
Right. If they come to us and just say scan and give us a report, we'll be like, you should probably go to someone else that's what they do, because it's not something that we're interested in. We really want very cutting edge type of security work. Again, like internal pen tests or a full blown red team where it's covert operation. We're trying to be stealthy. We're doing really advanced like shellcode injection with methods that we've developed and we've released in several of our blog posts, for example,
Yeah.
that will still get around a lot of detection. And fortunately and unfortunately, sometimes it gets around even our own detection for FireEye products. And
Sure.
so that's just part of our job because we have to come up with this, but it also gets around other products as well. The good news about that and the bad news is like it's always an uncomfortable discussion if we're in that situation. But every time we release something that does bypass our stuff, we give all that information to our engineering team. And then they're usually in the works of creating detections for something like that.
Yeah. And I see that neutrality, if you will, or you're not paying any special care to FireEye solutions. I see that as one of the strongest points because it's really easy to get into the trap that yeah, we're part of FireEye, and of course FireEye is going to catch 100% of what we do in this and that. And that's not the reality of life. And when FireEye acquired Veritin, we had the same conversations. It's like, look, you guys to be successful need to be able to operate in a neutral manner. You have to be vendor agnostic. And yes, we want you to be able to integrate and support, Helix and different FireEye solutions and threat intelligence and things like that. But also we need you to interact and integrate with the rest of the world as well. And not put the gloves on when you're going off into FireEye, but everybody else you're more aggressive. So we treat FireEye solutions like anybody else, a partner or a competitor, and that's one of the things that I think is really great about the approach here is that from a services side, from a threat intelligence side, a product side, we all seem to take that approach. Which I think is the healthiest way to do it. And I've seen it go other ways. I've been through a lot of acquisitions in my life. And I've seen things that aren't necessarily in the best interest of sort of good security effectiveness in terms of how it's approached and how the solutions are integrated. So that's pretty cool. Do you work pretty close with the threat intelligence team as well? Because I'm guessing you guys see a lot of new badness out there, whether it's APTs or what have you. And that's a great way of sort of feeding that back into the threat intel team.
Yeah, actually, we work pretty often with them because anytime they see something new and cool or a new technique that they saw, whether it be in an incident response engagement or detected by one of their products, they'll come to us and say, "Hey guys, check this out. This is like a super cool new technique. This is the data associated with it. Maybe you can apply that to your methodology." And it's like the best thing ever because we don't have to do all that research and development on our own all the time.
Yeah.
And that's really nice. In fact, a small little illusion. Right now, we're on February 15th. So, what will happen is in about a month, in maybe a month and a half, I'm going to be releasing a blog about DLL sideloading, where we were able to weaponize, like at scale, DLL sideloading because we pulled all the DLL sideloading that we had observed in our incident response engagements over the past, like, decade. And so I got hundreds of vulnerable signed Windows and even third-party binaries that were vulnerable to this, and the associated DLL and the export that was required for that DLL, so
Sure.
that we were able to create a framework for this, and we're going to release it to the public. We're not going to include all of them because obviously some of that's our proprietary FireEye intel,
Sure.
but we'll include like a few so that people have a good framework and examples of how this is still a thing. DLL sideloading has been around for like 10 years, so it's not something new, but because it's used so often, it still gets around everything. I just asked Intel, hey, I just want all the signed binaries that you've seen for the past decade
Yep.
and the associated DLL and the export, and they gave it all to me. And I was
That's
like,
awesome.
wow, within a few days of time. That would take months of research and development to come up with stuff like that, if not longer,
Easy.
maybe even
Yeah.
years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like the way we can scale some of the R&D here because we have an Intel team like that is just tremendous.
Yeah, and I see it on the Verid SIP side as well, because SIP being able to execute attacks, safely in the production environment is key. But the question is, where do you get these different attacks or these tests from? And we ship with them and we update them. But it's an open content platform. So we pull in malware traffic analysis the customer wants. If they've got packet captures of their own, if they've got different malware, they can write their own stuff in Shell or Python. Um, different types of imports, even pulling from different types of ISACs and things of that nature. But one of the things I really like is the threat intelligence integration. And of course, we integrate with FireEye, but we integrate with others as well, 451, Flashpoint, Anomaly, folks like that. But from a threat intel perspective, first of all, I think we have really great threat intelligence at FireEye. But the fact that services can feed into threat intel, and then that threat intel can then feed back into Verid SIP, which can then be leveraged by services to go through that whole cycle. That's pretty awesome, actually,
It's
right?
amazing. Yeah.
That's like wow. And we could have never had that type of synergy, if you will, when we were just Verid. So, people always ask, well, does this acquisition make sense? I'm not speaking about us specifically, but anytime an acquisition is made, I remember when I was with McAfee Labs and Intel bought us, there was forever people were, what, how does this make sense? That story was a little bit harder to tell. But when it comes down to Verid and FireEye, man, product and services and intelligence, it's such a compelling story. Especially, I was talking to a customer the other day on the podcast, and he mentioned that they retain Mandiant for critical incident response services when they need it. They have a team and they feel pretty strong about it, but every once in a while they need to call SWAT, if you will, right? And they need to have this team on standby. And in addition to that, when something happens and they see it in Helix, it pulls the related threat intelligence, and then it's just I think a more mature approach, and something that was really hard to do just through partnerships and APIs. Being one company certainly has a lot of value there.
Yeah, I mean, a great example of that is when this whole Iran situation that's going on. Like, we had a big backlash of like, hey, Iran's going to come after us because we just took out one of their major generals, and what are we going to do about it? And within a few days, Veridian responded with a bunch of new actions within the Veridian platform that replicates a lot of all the threat groups that we track that are related to Iran.
Yeah.
And that was done because FireEye Intelligence was able to provide that like this, and then you guys were able to put in actions for into the Verid SIP within a week, which was awesome. So now all of your clients can be better prepared to test their prevention and detection capabilities to all of those type of activities, which is amazing. I mean, talk about a value add within a week's time of responding to that sort of announcement, which is amazing.
Yeah. And that's kind of a good segue, actually, because now we're talking about, more of an offensive test combined with, actually building up your controls and validating that they're preventing from or alerting or detecting these types of activities. Kind of takes us to the purple teaming conversation that I really wanted to get to. And that's something that I know is near and dear to your heart, and something that you're the tip of the spear for that. Tell me a little bit about what FireEye is doing for purple teaming right now.
Yeah, so because of the acquisition, we're now able to use the Verid SIP to actually power our purple team engagements. Whereas before, we would do a purple team engagement, which I'll do a small brief overview of what that is. It's essentially, it's not a red team, it's not a pen test, it's a collaborative effort between the customer SOC, one of our incident response consultants, and one of our red team consultants, where the red team consultant is going to be doing a lot of different malicious TTPs, like, at every phase of the attack lifecycle, initial vectors, establish a foothold, persistence, lateral movement, etc. And then whenever they do these scenarios or these actions, the incident responder will take the evidence, go to the SOC and be like, hey, they just did this persistence technique. Were you able to see it? Let's look at your SIM. Let's look at your your EDR products or whatever technology stack that you have to see if it was caught anywhere.
Yeah.
And then we can determine whether it was detected and if they can respond to it. And if not, the incident responder will provide them the evidence that they need and the actual recommendations around how they can respond to that in the future. And if it's something like real quick, like, oh, you already have the log in the SIM, we just need to create an alert around it, they'll create the alert, we'll rerun the action again and see if they detect it. Now, that was kind of done before we had Verid SIP. Now we have Verid SIP So whenever we did these, we would do it manually. Let's just say persistence. We would do a scheduled task, create a service, create a WMI event subscriber, create a registry run key, etc. And we were able to do these manually on the keyboard on a provision system that they gave us. Well, now we can automate a lot of that and scale quality and consistency because we have the Verident SIP where all of these actions, which are like each one of what I just mentioned, are
Yeah.
already put into the Verident SIP. And that's really awesome because now we have 100, actually, we're now over 100 actions that are part of our playbook, whereas before we had 35.
Hmm.
So talk about a huge scale increase. And again, also consistency. Whenever we run it on one, it's going to be run the same way on another. It doesn't depend on which consultant's doing it or what flavor they like or whatever. It's the same
Yes.
across the board because the
Repeatability.
technology
Yeah.
does it. Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that's
That's
super
huge.
cool too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were chatting last week about one of our big oil and gas customers down in Texas. And this gentleman that we're working with, he's a Verident SIP customer, and he's been so for about 3 years now, so a little while. And he runs red teaming for the company globally. And he's got a relatively small team for the size of the company, but they do some good work. I think it's about a half a dozen people that are focused on some of the specific red teaming initiatives internally. Uh, and he said, he'd be driving into work and he'd get a call from his boss. Hey, I just heard about this new attack on CNN, or this thing just came across my email, whether it's, bad rabbits or wanna cry variant 1 2 3 14, whatever it is, whatever the latest sort of headline grabbing attacks that we occasionally see that non-technical, non-security people hear about. And of course he gets the call, are we safe from this? Can we detect this? Can we stop this? Where are we? And his response used to be, well, I don't know. Let me go find out. So because it's an oil and gas company, they had a combination of IT and SCADA and PLC devices, and some of it was talking Modbus and DNP3, and some of it was TCP/IP, and they had to build this test bed with a vulnerable machine and kind of replicate it. It's a lot of work. I guess is the easy way of saying it, and it takes a lot of time. So they build up this test bed, then they go and find the attack. They have to reverse engineer it. They have to make it routable on the network. They have to have a vulnerable machine. They have to launch it against that, and they have to see, do our controls address that? And after all that work, and you're talking 6, 7, 8 weeks in now, that you've taken your security team off of doing real security stuff and had them building up a lab and doing these types of things, you get back and say, yeah, I'm relatively confident that we are, or we're not. But it's not definitive, right? There's no real empirical evidence. And what was cool, he said, when we switched to leveraging Verident SIP for a lot of this, he would say, hey, are we vulnerable to this new pen attack? He says, I don't know. Let me see if it's already in there. If it's not in there, let me grab the PCAP from malware traffic analysis or some other capture, or whatever, and I'll go ahead and inject that in. And within a few seconds, the Verident SIP director will make that routable and weaponize it. And you can go ahead and start validating on the production network with the real controls that are in place, with the real systems, but never putting those systems at risk, and get back and say, yes, we are preventing it, or we're detecting it, or we're not. And he was able to do something that took weeks and do it in hours. But the coolest part of that story was, he said it kind of remapped how they thought about their own initiatives when they're doing validation of their security controls, and how they worked with the blue team then to help address and fix those controls. And it made them so effective that projects that they had slotted for 2022, they're actually doing this year in 2020, because they were so efficient and so effective with that team. And to me, that was the real cool thing. They were able to make some real big technical leaps, but those technical leaps allowed them to actually improve the business and be truly more efficient, more effective by order of 2 years, which is probably one of my favorite stories in terms of, here's a PCAP. How has this changed my life?
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, that's
Yeah,
a huge value add. I mean, it's just one of those people tell me all the time, like, oh, we'll be able to detect you, or we'll be able to detect your red team or in an adversary. And I'm like, okay, how do you know? Like, what sort of testing have you done? Oh, no, it's because we bought all this tech and we've implemented all this, technology and security and policies. I'm like, that's cool. Like, but what have you done to actually test these security controls? Have
yeah,
you, test the refinement of this technology? People sometimes buy a piece of technology and out of the box they're like, it's going to catch all the stuff. Like, how often does that actually happen? Like, never. You have
yeah,
to refine it, you have to tune it, you have to tweak it, you have to test and rinse and repeat. And I just see all the time people make this claim, and then we'll go in there and just crush it and be like, well, you hadn't tested before, so that's why we're here to help you. And I encourage people all the time, either do a red team. A purple team is huge when it comes to detection and response. Depending on what level of maturity that they are, it will depend on what the right assessment is for them. But
Yeah.
I constantly see this all the time, where people will make the claim but not having actually tested it to see what the effectiveness is until they actually go through some of these assessments.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, because I've discovered over 2 decades in this space, I guess, um, people buy products based on two things: security products. One, how much do I like the sales engineer, right? That's number one. Number two, how good was the default configuration in terms of, I don't want it to be too loud, you're going to make my job too hard. I don't want it to be too quiet, because then I don't think you're doing anything. So they kind of aim for this middle, which is never the right position for anybody. And people have to configure these, whether it's a firewall or IPS or email security or endpoint or DLP, it doesn't matter. Um, there has to be that tuning. And I see a lot of organizations that have great tools. I'm sure you see this as well. They've got, they spend millions or tens of millions or more on security controls. But at the end of the day, they have no way to test and validate that these security controls are actually providing value. So they base their measures on security effectiveness on, are my devices vulnerable and can they be exploited? And do I need to patch them? Well, if all you're doing is patching vulnerabilities, why the heck are you spending so much money on security controls anyways? Just patch everything if that's going to be your bread and butter. But the reality is, a lot of times those tools are in place, and I'm sure you see this from your side. It's just they're improperly tuned, or there's some environmental drift. Like, they were working really well last month, but now something happened and they're not working well this month. Somebody changed a tap, so it's unidirectional instead of bidirectional. A proxy is stopping syslog services from getting to the SIM. Somebody did an upgrade and now parsing has changed. There's a gazillion issues why things break over time. Uh, so a lot of times it just comes down to that configuration, which is one of, I think, the tenets of purple teaming, which is saying, look, red team's going to help identify this, but let's work in conjunction with the blue team. Let's have this purple team approach. So we're actually making real grown-up forward business progress on these things. Um, are you seeing that mentality being adopted broadly, or is it still a little bit of a sales pitch to get people to accept that, yeah, purple teaming might be the new, if you will?
I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it adopted. To be honest, I think
Okay.
it's been getting a lot of good traction in the market. Some of our competitors have started offering this service as well.
Mm,
Whereas before, it was offered, but not as many competitors actually did it. Whereas
mm,
now I'm seeing a larger number of competitors introduce it as a service offering. Whereas we've been doing this for like the past 5 years, but in the past we called it a red team for SOC, and people were like, "Is that a red team? Are you red team in the SOC infrastructure? Or
yeah.
what is a red team for SOC?" And it took a lot of education to try to tell the market what it actually is, when really it was a purple team. But because the industry accepts a purple team as like a standard assessment, people know what that is. It's less confusing. After we acquired Veridin, we took that as opportunity to rebrand the whole thing and call it a purple team.
Yeah.
And so that's been widely adopted internally. It's been widely adopted in the market. We've
Good.
been getting a lot of traction on it. And it's something that other competitors are also offering and also calling it a purple team. So I think it's definitely something that's been getting a lot more attention in the market, because it's such a value in terms of service. If you and there's two reasons for this.
Yeah.
One reason is because people are now spending, like you said, a lot of money on technology and refinement. Whereas in the past, the whole security industry has been evolving. It's been increasing, it's been maturing. People have been spending a lot more money in it. They've been refining it over the past few years. Let's just say, for example, one of the big companies, like a huge Fortune 500, 5 years ago, they just started increasing their security capabilities, and that's actually very true. A lot of companies weren't putting as much money into it. There wasn't as much budget for security. It was always like the bastard child of IT, for example.
Yeah.
And then now it's like, oh, this is a huge problem. We're losing millions of dollars when we get breached. We need to put more money into this. And since that has been evolving, since they started establishing these security teams, since they started putting more budget into technology and all this stuff, now they're starting to see like, well, we have a problem in refinement, like you said, in tuning and testing. And so that whole service industry has also been evolving as well. We're seeing it on the red team pen testing and now purple teaming, where people are starting to realize that we need to actually test our security controls. So
Yeah.
it's been super widely adopted because that industry and that sector of a lot of these major companies is still evolving and maturing. And now we're just at that level where they have a mature capability now. Let's test the effectiveness. Whereas before,
Yeah.
let's just say, for example, someone, and this has happened, someone comes to us and is like, hey, we want a purple team engagement. I want to see what our response and detection capabilities are. Okay, cool. What sort of SIM do you have? Well, we don't have one. What sort of, what do your socks do? Like, what's your method currently from going from an event to an incident? But we don't have a process in place for that. Okay, cool. What sort of EDR detection do you have? I don't have one. We have AV. I'm like, okay, well, you're probably not ready for a purple team. So like
Yeah.
that whole, we don't want to sell something to a client that's not in their best interest is a huge thing for us.
Yep.
So we want to make sure that clients are ready for that level of service. And so maybe for someone like that, it would be more of a pen test before they get to a purple team, for example, because
Yeah.
it's just a different motive. And again, their level of maturity is just not quite there yet. And so I think the level of maturity from a number of customers' perspective has increased over time. So that's why this has been a service that's been way more widely adopted and a lot more popular these days, because we have more clients that are ready for it than we ever have in the past.
Yeah. I'm also seeing a maturation in terms of what's being validated. So when we first started Veridan, we started the company and sort of had the idea of what we want to go after. Validating tech was first. Let's validate and ensure that endpoint security, email security, cloud security, network security, all these controls are not just operating, but continue to operate in perpetuity through automation and continuous validation. So let's just make sure our security tools work. Uh, and that was pretty strong. But pretty quickly, we found customers that said, you know what, I want to start using this for people and process as well. And one customer that really stood out in my mind was a government agency. And they said, look, we have the same problem that everybody else has, which is finding talent. And then once you find talented people, keeping those people. We don't want them to get certified in 5 different things and then leave. And it's just hard to get people. Oftentimes people, the pay scales are quite a bit different. So one of the things that they've done is they said, look, when we go through the interview process, let's just not base it on LinkedIn and resumes. Let's actually sit somebody down in our operations center, supervised. Let's execute a bunch of attacks with Veridan SIP. And with Veridan, you can do things either in clandestine mode, so you don't know it's coming from Veridan, or you can do it in a way that is not clandestine. It's above board, so everybody knows, okay, I don't have to focus on this right now. So they execute some attacks, and they'll say, okay, what would you do? Would you go to the firewall? Would you do a packet trace? Would you Google something? Would you phone a friend? What's your mental process? And they're actually using it to help in their hiring. And I thought that was really cool to actually help sort of validate candidates. And they're not expecting them to be experts in their environment, but they do want to see what's your mental process as you kind of go through an incident, which I thought was really, really cool. And what they found was there might be some people that have, decades of experience, but maybe it's not as relevant to their environment as somebody with a little bit less experience, and their resume doesn't look as sexy, but they're really effective in this environment and somebody that they can train. So that was one piece. Then they said, once that we get somebody on board, we want to continue to do this testing to help ensure that everyone's trained up and ready to go. Like we've got the Super Bowl coming up, right? And if weeks leading up to the Super Bowl, people are just the players are sitting on the couch and eating hot dogs and drinking beer, it's probably not the best way to prep. But they said, look, we've got these teams that maybe we do some type of war gaming once a year or twice a year if we're lucky, and maybe it's a little bit more than kind of doing it on a whiteboard and sitting around a table. But with this, we can do sort of constant training and practicing, right? Making sure that our teams, when that event does happen, yeah, we're ready to go, because we do this all the time. We've got our processes vetted out, and we know how to go from an event to an incident. And that actually helps define processes as well. Because maybe we had this process that was really contingent on Bob, and now Bob's no longer here, right? And the person that replaced Bob doesn't know what's going on. So now the process is broken. Or it was really specific to these certain products, but those products have now changed out. So the processes and the people keep on tweaking as well. So we always talk about people, process, and technology and security. 99% of the time, people really just mean technology. But what I'm seeing with security instrumentation, I'm curious to see if you're seeing this from a Purple Team perspective, is it's really valuable to help hire and train your people and help continuously redefine that process. And that's happened in a few isolated incidents over the years, but now I'm seeing it become sort of a leading use case And I'm curious to see if from a purple teaming perspective, if that people process portion of the equation has kind of started to rise to equal to the technology side.
Yeah, I think that people process is still something that is maturing. We're not quite to where I think we could be. Where a lot of times, like you said, it's a focus on technology. Can the technology detect on this activity? And then if it does, they contain and respond to it, whatever. But the response strategy is really important, and that's where it comes down to process. So, what is the process from event to incident? Whenever it becomes an incident, what's the process to respond to that incident? Do they have a response plan in place? And I would say, in my experience doing these assessments, 30% of our clients have a response plan in place. Most of the time, the response plan is ad hoc.
Okay.
Okay, let's go contain that system, reimage it, and done. And
Yeah.
whereas some people actually do an investigation, they'll pull down they can do it two ways. Depending on what EDR platform they have, they may do a live response analysis on the system itself, or they may just pull an image of the system and then do forensics on it, depending on whether they do dead box forensics or whether they do live response analysis. And that's also maturity, capability, and technology level. But that's really important because some people don't even know how to do live response analysis. Maybe they haven't been trained. Some people
Yeah.
don't know how to do forensics. Maybe they haven't been trained. So, like you said, it's making sure they have the right people in place and making sure that they're trained up on what it is. Because if it's a real incident, that really needs to require some real investigation, because you may contain that system, but who's not to say that attacker's not on three other systems that you haven't detected yet, right? So
Yeah.
an investigation is key to actually scale the identification of other compromised systems, and what C2s are going to, how many different C2s are going to, what fully qualified domains they're using, what persistence mechanisms they're using, so that you can scale detection on these other systems itself, aside from technology. So people and process is really key, because you can refine technology with people and process depending on the investigation process.
Yeah.
So that's really, really important. We see this all the time on our Mandiant incident response engagements, and that's why it's so critical. And also, what do you do? What's so there's technology effectiveness, and then there's also maturity effectiveness, and
Mm.
that's where it comes down to what's the process afterwards. Who do you escalate to? And then if you escalate to that person, what's the process for making sure that that person then escalates to someone else, and then what paperwork do you have to do, and how do you document this? And if you do, for example, forensic analysis, you have to do evidence tagging, make sure that state of the actual system itself stays, the integrity stays complete. So maybe they don't do evidence tagging properly, whereas like at Mandiant, we have a whole forensics lab, just like the FBI, for example, where that evidence and the integrity of that evidence stays the same throughout the whole thing,
Yeah.
and that whole process is being tracked. So that all just depends on the process, right? So everything I just mentioned is obviously a lot of different things and maturity levels at all the different places, but it's rare that we see a client have the full maturity model in place. And I think that's something that's still evolving, and not near to the technologies. That people are still putting a lot of emphasis on the technology piece, which is really important.
Yeah.
But I think people and process is also really important, and people need to continue evolving that space, because I haven't seen it to where I think it needs to be yet.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, we generally find that about 25% of preventative controls are configured the way you think, about 50% from a detection perspective, and from a sim or learning perspective, about 25%. So if you put that into dollars, right, you spend, $1 million on a preventative control, maybe you're getting $250,000 worth of value. It's just not a great equation. Um, but it's also gotten to the point now where, security has always wanted a voice with the executive team. We've always wanted a voice with the board, right? Because we felt it was that critical, and sort of, banging our fists on the table. And well, now it's happened, right? Now that voice has happened, and you have the opportunity now to talk to executives, non-technical, non-security executives, as well as the board, and they're interested because they have to be interested, because there's material risk involved, because shareholders and stakeholders, they have concerns. I'm even seeing CEOs of power and energy companies, which would hardly ever talk about cyber, are now on the news on talking about cybersecurity. And they didn't do it because one day they woke up and they felt, boy, this is something I really want to get behind. They do it because they have to do it, because it's in their, it's in their corporate governance documents. It's in their, their various filings that they do, and they have to report on this just like they would if there's some type of environmental issue or issue related to political unrest, right? So now it's become that issue. So I'm wondering, because it's such a high level perspective and executives and boards care about it, when you're going in and you're doing some of these purple teaming exercises, does it kind of stop at the CISO, or are sometimes you talking to the COO, the CEO, boards, audit committees? I mean, how high do you generally get this message up there?
From a purple team engagement perspective, generally it's at the CISO level,
Yep.
where we're up to that point, and that's usually where it'll stop. Some of our incident response engagements obviously will hit the CEO level because they're compromised. But
Yeah.
from a purple team perspective, generally, from my experience so far, it's been at the CISO level, and that's generally as high as it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how, and do you find when you're on site, are you sometimes working with the audit groups and the audit committees, or do they not get involved as much?
It depends also on the motive. Security and audit sometimes don't always get along. So,
Yeah.
if we're hired by a security team, then usually audit doesn't get involved. If we're hired by the audit team, then obviously they're involved from the beginning, and they'll bring in the security team, and they'll come and try to take what we're doing and apply everything that we recommended. But that whole relationship between audit and security sometimes doesn't always get along, and
Yeah.
sometimes they do.
Yeah.
Just depending.
And I saw that historically as well in companies prior to Veridan. But there's something interesting about, and I agree with you. The audit committee and the security teams definitely have a little bit of a different approach and motivation and background. But somebody told me something once, that the most powerful committee now on a publicly traded company's board is the audit committee. And the audit committee has stopped asking, do we have security controls in place to mitigate risks? Because the answer is always the same. Of course we do, but also give us another box of money because we always need to buy more stuff. Now they're getting a little bit more specific, and they're saying, can you prove that those security controls that you have in place are actually working, which aligns perfectly with what Veridan SIP's all about, right? Let's make sure the tools we have are working. And furthermore, can you prove that that box of money that you asked for is something that you really need, or we can't just tune what we've already got? And a great example of that are hospitals. If you look at healthcare providers, most of them start from about a 30% deficit because they can't refuse care. So they know there's going to be people that they have to treat that just won't be able to ever pay them. And they run at pretty tight margins. So every dollar that I put into cybersecurity is a dollar I can't put into MRI machines and doctors and nurses and other things that I need to provide patient care. So because of that, we're starting to see in certain verticals where when people are looking at security instrumentation and how effective their controls are, it's actually rising above the CISO. And CEO, maybe not, but CFO and COO quite often, certainly chief risk officers, and certainly specific members of the board. Usually most publicly traded companies have somebody on the board, at least one person that is a little bit more cyber savvy. And then, of course, there's the audit committee as well. So it's interesting to see it kind of going up in that direction, because we've been asking for it for a long time as an industry, but now we've kind of gotten there. And I think as purple teaming continues to evolve, that will be part of that as well. At least that's my crystal ball prediction, anyways, because we saw that evolution. We're seeing that evolution with SIP, and purple teaming, I think, would fit right in there.
Yeah, and it makes sense that the audit committee will hire us to do like either a purple team or, like you said, Veridan SIP, to actually prove whether they can do that or not. Because they're always, like you said, they're always going to say the same thing. Yes, we're ready, and yes, we could do this. And I really love the whole notion of let's prove it. Let's actually test the effectiveness to see what budget you actually need or not.
Evan, as we wrap up here, any last things that you want to say before we finish up?
Well, just again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on here. I hope that I wasn't as awkward. I don't do the whole video podcast thing very often, so hopefully that all looked okay. But no, I mean, I really enjoy talking about this. I think I'm very passionate, like you said, about the service line, about Veridan. Again, I think the synergy in the whole ecosystem of FireEye Intelligence, Fire Incident Response, red teaming and purple teaming and Veridan SIP is just a perfect combination of it all together. And I'm very fortunate to be able to, like you said, kind of drive the whole services approach to how we're using Veridin. And I think so far we've been using it now for about 6 months in a pilot beta version kind of
Yep.
thing with our service offering, and it's been really, really awesome. And we're in a new year now, and in 2020 we're going to be only using this for all of our purple team engagements, because again, the scale is just tremendous
Yeah.
on how many actions we can actually do versus how we were able to do it manually in the past.
Sure.
So really excited to see us continue to evolve it. Every time you guys come out with really cool new actions from our FireEye intelligence, we will review those, incorporate it into our purple team playbooks. So again, we're increasing on a monthly basis the playbook action numbers. So that's also awesome, because for the past we had the same 35 scenarios on every single red team for SOC, and we would do maybe a couple here and there that were custom to the client. And now we could just scale this at a tremendous level. So really glad to be a part of this team, and be a part of the acquisition, and helping drive this forward.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for taking some time. I really appreciate it. And safe travels, man. I'll talk to you soon.